There is a ton of conflicting advice about what foods are healthy or nutritious and what you should eat. So how can you tell? How do you decide? Especially if you have limited time and energy, you have other things to do. You don't want to become a world-class food expert and spend years researching it. You want to outsource a lot of the research and effort and thinking on this issue to other people, to experts. You want to specialize. You are a car mechanic or whatever, and someone else is a food researcher, and you don't want to become a food researcher. This is the division of labor, which is good for physical labor. Like one person is a carpenter and one is an electrician and one is a plumber, and that's more efficient than them all being generalists. And the division of labor is also good for intellectual labor. Like you can learn how to do plumbing and someone else can learn how to do food nutrition studies. And even if you wanted to learn all the things, there's way too many. You're not going to learn it all. You could learn about food specifically, but then there'd be a bunch of other things that would be good to look into that you wouldn't have had time to look into. So you're going to have to, at some point, look at some other people's research and thinking and stuff and review their stuff, look at summaries or skim through it and make some decisions about who you think is right and why, and take some sides when there are disagreements among experts. That is an important skill, an important thing to be able to do. So I used to think basically that society was competent and science was competent, and that they studied things and decided the foods were safe and the government was regulating it and blah, blah, blah. And so if it's being sold in a safe way, it's probably fine. I no longer believe this. One of the things that has come up, which I've known about for a long time, the replication crisis, where a lot of scientific studies cannot be replicated. A lot have been withdrawn. A lot of them are wrong. There's a lot of bad science out there. I've also read various scientific papers, as well as non-scientific academic papers, and found lots of errors and flaws of all sorts of types, like huge conceptual errors or misquotes or math errors, all kinds of things. So my opinion of the general competence of society has gone down. And then another thing that I found out is that a lot of issues where people think there's a bunch of evidence and study and science and stuff are actually really understudied. Science just hasn't gotten around to testing a lot of stuff. There's a bunch of science that's not great, but like somewhat works and it's somewhat useful. And there's a bunch of issues where we just don't even have that. A lot of scientific funding follows certain fads and trends. Like there's tons and tons of stuff related to global warming. For better or worse, there's tons of money going to those kinds of things. And then there's a lot less money going to other things, like figuring out which food additives are safe. And funding for scientific research comes primarily from the governments and sometimes from industry, and maybe sometimes from universities, and like occasionally from some sort of charity. And so you can think about these groups, like what are their goals? What types of things do they fund and why? There isn't just funding for everything because it would be useful or because it's something that society ought to know. It doesn't just automatically happen because it should get done. There has to be an actual mechanism by which the funding takes place and the work gets done. There have to be incentives for someone to actually do that. And government, industry, academia, universities, nonprofit, well, there's a lot of incentive problems there. Like sometimes they do some good things, but there are plenty of like gaps or holes or issues where some good things don't get done. And the government is just generally not very competent or good at things. So to take an example, it's not an additive, but homogenization of milk. It is a physical process where they basically squeeze the milk under high pressure in order to break down the fat pieces that are larger into small fat pieces that are all the same size. And they do this because fat doesn't dissolve in water. And milk is mostly water, so the fat doesn't dissolve in water. In other words, the fat floats to the top. You got the cream on the top. That is the natural way milk works. If you like milk a cow and you put the milk into a pitcher and then you just leave it there for a while, you're going to get a bunch of fat floating to the top. So you have cream on top and milk below. and you can mix it up, and then it's going to separate again. And if you homogenize milk, that doesn't happen. You get really tiny fat particles distributed through the milk, and they actually stay distributed through the milk instead of floating to the top. This has significant advantages. There's good reasons they're doing it. It helps with shelf life. It helps with not having to shake your milk before you use it. It helps with like consistency of the product. And it helps with transportation. When you're trying to transport milk and it's getting shook, it's in a truck or a train, that can churn butter on top. But if you use homogenized milk, then it stays milk. This is my understanding. I'm not a super expert. There could be the occasional error, but I think those are generally accurate. Okay, so those are the reasons they're doing homogenization. But none of them are to make the milk healthier or a better food. Pasteurization is done to make it a better food. Pasteurization, by the way, has well-known downsides. It kills some of the, or breaks up some of the protein. There are downsides to pasteurizing milk. Pasteurizing milk is heating it, like cooking the milk, basically. And we do that because it kills a lot of bacteria. And so we think that is worth the downsides. And as far as I know, that is correct and reasonable. You pasteurize the milk and then kill a lot of bacteria, and it loses a little bit of nutritional value, or maybe even a medium amount, I don't know. But killing all that bacteria is worth it. If you had fresh milk from your own cow on your farm, though, it probably wouldn't be worth pasteurizing if you could eat it quickly. Pasteurization makes sense when you have like large farms that are distributing milk to lots of people, some of whom are far away. And the milk has to last over time more. Which is important. That allows a large civilization with division of labor where we don't all have to be farmers. Anyway, homogenization does not kill bacteria. It does not have some sort of clear known reason why it makes milk better, what the upside is. Like, it has practical reasons for transportation and stuff, but is it a good idea? Or are there downsides? This is very understudied. Apparently, when they first started homogenizing milk, customers did not like it. The milk looked weird. It's not that they knew science or had some sort of important objection. It was just the milk seemed weird. They thought maybe they were getting shorted on the fat because there was no fat floating at the top. Maybe the fat is gone, was taken out and stolen from them. Was one of the things some people thought. Anyways, and so one of the solutions to that, it apparently took 20 years for the dairy industry to get people to accept homogenized milk. And what they did was they made cardboard milk cartons where you can't see inside. That's not transparent. So you can't see that it is homogenized. You can't see that there's no fat floating on top. So they just tricked people a little bit, or just put something out of plain sight so people wouldn't notice anymore. I don't know how true that story really is, but that's what I've seen as a story. Anyway, there are some actual reasons to be concerned about homogenization. Our society has just decided it's fine, but okay, so a somewhat comparable example is making smoothies in a blender. You might think that when you blend fruit, it basically doesn't matter at all. It's the same as eating the fruit whole. But that is incorrect. Blending it breaks up the fiber, breaks it into smaller pieces, which changes how it is digested. So basically, you get more of a sugar rush when you drink a smoothie than if you eat the same thing as whole fruit. The sugar can get digested faster, and there's less fiber effectively, because fiber can help slow down digestion, but blending up the fiber makes it do that less. Homogenizing milk is fairly similar to putting it through a blender. The effect is similar. And so we already know from the blender issue that that kind of thing can affect it, can affect how we digest it, can make a difference. And so there are some anti-homogenization of milk arguments that say basically that turning the fat into tiny pieces causes it to be absorbed more. You digest more of it, you get more fat calories. And on top of that it can more easily penetrate barriers within your body because it's smaller. And therefore you get more of it going to different places in your body. And so it gets absorbed in more different parts of your body. And that the fat itself being absorbed in these various different places is okay. The fat is not like a poison, it's not harmful. However, it brings with it various proteins and other things that are attached to it, that are stuck to it. and it brings those to other places in your body, and then those are harmful. And this story is plausible. There's a little bit of research on it. Like, people who are in favor of homogenization, you can look at some of their information and some of their diagrams, and they will show, like, before, and you have the fat, and you have some big ones and some small ones, and then there's the proteins or whatever, and you've got some little dots here and there in the milk in their diagram. And then you look at the homogenized diagram, and the fats are all tiny, and they're all the same size, and then some of them have the proteins attached to them. Like, they know that when you homogenize the milk, some of the proteins attach to the fat that were not previously attached to the fat. And then there was a study of infant milk and how well so they were looking at underweight infants and feeding them milk and trying to get them to gain weight. And they found that homogenized milk was absorbed more by the infants. And so they thought that was good because they were trying to help underweight infants gain weight. But for most people, that might be bad. And it seems to support the idea that the fat is being absorbed more, including those proteins that are now stuck to it. And then there's a bunch of pro-homogenization people who are just like, oh, there's no evidence that there's a problem here. There's no evidence that these concerns are really happening. No, but you do have evidence. Like, you looked at this one study, there's not nearly enough evidence. There should be way more studies, but there's a little bit of evidence that found that the homogenized milk was being absorbed more in this one case. And they do have some evidence about the homogenized milk having the proteins get stuck to it. So it is different. It has an effect, and it is understudied. There is not a lot of evidence about whether it's good or bad, safe, unsafe, whatever. And they did not do it over some sort of explanation that would be better for you. And on general principles, so what is milk? It is made by evolution. There's an evolutionary process that gave animals the ability to have milk to provide food for their babies. So evolution adapted the milk to be good the way it is. It is adapted to be nutritious and good for you. Now, I know we mostly drink cow's milk, which was not adapted for humans, but basically we found cow's milk is close enough, and it seems to work pretty well for humans because humans and cows, on a biological level, have a ton of similarity. So if it is adapted by evolution to be good for us, then we probably shouldn't change it. Like, by default, leave it alone. Evolution already adapted it to be good. Anything we change is probably going to make it worse. If smaller fat molecules were better, evolution probably already would have done that. Evolution is pretty good at making that kind of tinkering when it provides a survival advantage. So, based on evolutionary reasoning, I would expect whatever size fat molecules we're finding in the milk are probably good, and bigger or smaller is probably worse. Unless there is some science showing otherwise, that's what I would think. So homogenization is probably bad for some reason. And people have actual reasons, and then it just doesn't really get studied. So that is one example. So what kind of general principles can you use for how to eat? What is relatively safe when you can't trust the experts that much and stuff is not studied enough? You should tend to eat whole foods and simple foods, like less processing, fewer additives. You should eat on the conservative side. Just keep it simple. Don't overreach. There's no one additive or artificial food or whatever that I'm especially afraid of or would strongly recommend against. I don't think you have to be super extreme about this, but everything else being equal, you should tend against tinkering with things for no good reason and just eat simple foods, whole foods, stuff that's more like what our ancestors ate that worked okay for them. When you do a bunch of processing or changing the food in some way or extracting parts of it, there is a chance that something goes wrong, that you do something bad. And it is unnecessary to do that all the time. There are some benefits to doing it. Sometimes we can make some sorts of foods we like, but eating a heavily processed, manufactured, factory food diet that is seriously understudied, then no one has any idea if it's safe. They just started doing it because it was convenient for mass production, or because it tasted good, or because it looked good or preserved long and had long shelf life, or microwave well or whatever. Those are all a bunch of factors that are not chosen for health. Or if it's cheap, that's also not chosen for health. And so if people are making a bunch of modifications to food for reasons other than health and nutrition, and you're not really sure what's healthy or nutritious, then you should tend to stay away from those changes that were made for other reasons and just stick more to the defaults. Which means, for example, that non-homogenized would be a better choice. Now, it's harder to find, it costs more. There are reasons not to drink it, and I don't think it is a huge deal, but everything else being equal, it does sound safer, more conservative. When in doubt, be conservative, don't overreach, don't think you know what you're doing. Think about it, if we're really ignorant about food, what should we do? Or if I was making this at home, would I do this? Would I milk my cow and then put the milk through a machine that runs it through tiny little valves at high pressure? Probably not. Another example, so we have like orange juice and we have it year round. We have a lot of foods where we get them year round based on the harvest. And this involves basically a lot of our foods can be stored for up to around a year. We use preservation methods that let them last that long. And so first of all, everything else being equal, it'd be better to eat fresher food, not food that is up to a year old. Second of all, we actually know about some downsides of what we're doing. We know that when we pasteurize some of the food, we kill some of the vitamins and stuff, which is why we put some vitamins back in, like we add vitamin C to some of our stuff, including, I think, orange juice. So you might think the pasteurization of the orange juice killed some vitamin C and a few other things, and then they add them back in, and that's fine. But there is some cause for concern there. Like, we don't really know what we're doing that well. We figured out some things that the pasteurization was screwing up or destroying or changing, and we did something to try to fix that. But maybe it did something else that we don't realize. Maybe there's something else we should be adding back in, and we don't know that. So everything else being equal, it'd be better to have fresh squeezed orange juice, or just eat whole oranges. Juice is actually high in sugar and can cause a sugar spike in your body, basically. Our bodies are not evolved for having that much sugar in that concentrated of a form. Because like our ancestors would have eaten whole oranges instead of juicing them for a long time. Juicing them, you're getting rid of a bunch of the fiber and some of the other stuff, so you're getting more concentrated sugar. I don't believe all the concerns about sugar people have, but sugar is an important molecule that our body has to regulate. So we produce insulin and regulate our blood sugar. And diabetics are people where that process is not working. They have to take artificial insulin and stuff. And anyway, there's a complex process there and it has to work correctly. And when you take large doses of sugar water, then that is not what our body is expecting. It can screw with that a bit. So that is a reason to have a little bit of concern about fruit juice or soda or hot, like coffee or tea with a lot of sugar in it, or ice cream or milkshakes or some other things too, and candy. I'm not saying don't eat those things, just on general principles. When you don't know what you're doing, you should tend towards being more conservative. So if you really like it and you have it sometimes, probably not a big deal. But overall, you should be finding some ways to be more conservative with the food that you're okay with if you want to eat better. You might have other priorities and want to put your effort somewhere else and just not even think about food. But if you want to think about food and make any changes, then these are some of the ideas you could use. There are a lot of people who want to eat a bit better, but they put very little thought into it. They do no research and they just see labels like organic and then they buy that and they pay extra for it. And a lot of the organic food is made by the same giant companies and they just made a new brand name. They sell food under many different names and they just made an organic brand. And the rules for what counts as organic are stupid and problematic and do not do a good job at all figuring out what is safer or healthier or anything. So just buying the organic stuff is not an effective way to outsource your thinking. Like, you're taking these companies you don't trust, and that's why you're buying organic, is you don't trust the the big agriculture and the big food processors and whatever. But then a lot of the organic stuff is from the same people, and it's not well regulated and well studied and whatever. And some of the like organic pesticides they use instead of the regular pesticides are similarly bad or worse, or we have no idea. There's no particular reason to think some of that stuff is better. And I saw something about a farm. They said their food is not labeled organic. They follow most of the rules for organic food. However, if one of their cows gets sick, they want their vet to be able to make a judgment call and say, you know what, this cow should have some antibiotics to help them get not sick and not die. And they want to be allowed to do that, but the organic rules have something against giving antibiotics to the cows. And so they can't get their food labeled organic because they want to be able to save the occasional sick cow. And the rules, I think, were intended because some of these big farms would just give all their cows antibiotics all the time. And so that was considered non-organic and maybe problematic. And so the rules they wrote ended up preventing this small farm from giving antibiotics to individual cows when they were specifically sick and just as a general preventative measure. So that's just an example of how the organic labeling is broken and dumb and not what you would expect it to be. So if you just follow the labels on the food and it says, oh, this one's organic, this one's healthy or whatever, you're just trusting the same people and believing them just like before. It doesn't help. Oh yeah, tangentially, I had another comment about the milk homogenization. So if more fat from the milk is being absorbed into your body, so you're getting more calories from the same amount of milk, is that good or bad? If you're trying to lose weight, maybe it's bad. But you could say that if you're trying to lose weight, just drink less milk. And getting more calories like per cup of milk is good, and just drink the right amount of milk for how many calories you want. And so there's a problem here, which is that our body has to send us hunger signals. It has to figure out, like, have we eaten enough before we digest the food? Like, we don't eat and then digest the food and then stop eating when the food is digested and we know we're not hungry anymore. Our body has to estimate, like, how many calories is it going to get from this food before it's digested. It makes advanced estimate, so it can tell you to stop eating because digestion takes a while. So it needs to tell you to stop eating pretty quickly, or 15 minutes after you start eating. But digestion takes way longer than that. So your body has ways of estimating how many calories are in the food that you just ate. So it has a rough idea of how much volume of food you ate and maybe how much weight of food you ate. And it knows the taste of the food, and it looks for fat and sugar and maybe a few other things when it's tasting the food. And you can smell the food and there are a few other things. And so overall, your body comes up with some sort of idea of how many calories it thinks you're going to get. If your body is wrong, that is going to cause you trouble because you're going to feel hungry and keep eating and then overeat. If your body thinks that it is going to get fewer calories than it actually gets, you're going to overeat. If it's wrong the other way, you'll undereat. So what happens if you process milk with homogenization, and then people can get more calories out of milk? One of the things that might happen is your body will think, oh, I get this many calories from a glass of milk. And then because of the homogenization, you actually get more, so you end up overeating. Your body does not turn off your hunger quickly enough because it underestimates how many calories that you'll actually digest from the milk. By the way, our understanding of calories is really quite bad. Like the measurements of how many calories are in different foods, not very accurate. Basically, they burned the foods and saw how much chemical energy was in them. But when we eat the foods, we have to digest them, which is a different process than burning them. And we get different amounts of calories out of foods. And this is understudy. There's not enough science actually figuring out how many calories we get from different foods. So all those labels are quite misleading. And there have been occasional studies that tried to look at something and they found that the like official calorie numbers were just wrong. And if you drink tons of homogenized milk, you can train your body to think that to change its estimate for hunger. So it starts thinking milk has more calories in it than it used to. And then if you go back to non-homogenized milk, your body estimate incorrectly. And that could also apply to other things. It could cause inaccurate estimation of the food you're eating for anything with some similar properties to milk. So cheese or ice cream or just something with fat in it. Who knows? There is a similar issue with artificial sweeteners. They trick your body. The whole point of them is to trick your body. Like, they taste sweet while not having calories, so they taste like they have more calories than they do have. That is the point of them. But when you do that, you're screwing with your body's hunger mechanism and its ability to predict how much food you should be eating before you stop feeling hungry. If you're going back and forth between artificial sweeteners and actual sweets, things with actual sugar in them, which pretty much everyone does. No one eats purely artificial sweeteners. Like, they might not eat raw sugar, but they'll eat some fruit or something with a sweet taste that is real, not artificial, or not 0 calorie or whatever. So it will confuse your body and cause incorrect hunger signals.